Hello everyone, I hope you are doing well. Today, the subject of my lecture is 20th century English poetry, two traditions. So, in today's lecture, we will discuss two traditions that were there in 20th century English poetry. First of all, let's start the topic with the first tradition that was kind of traditional tradition, or you can say that was the tradition set by Thomas Hardy, and then we have the next tradition which was set by T.S. Eliot, and that was known as modernism. So let's start the lecture at the topic from the first point here. English poetry has boomed in the 20th century, but it is no longer possible for poets to live by the pen. In 20th century, this poetry boomed, no doubt, it flourished in this century. But it was not possible for the poets to live by the pen. So you can say that poetry was not kind of profession, right? People were not able to earn a lot from the poetry. Still, if they were poets, still they had to work for their living. It was not possible for them to live by the pen only. Even the great writers of the time as well, they had to work alongside their poetry work. The greatest poetry of the century, T.S. Eliot, the greatest poet of the century, T.S. Eliot, was obliged to support himself as a bank clerk while writing his masterwork. So this is the case we were discussing in the first few points, that even the greatest poet of the century, named as T.S. Eliot, he had to work. He had to work as a bank clerk when he was writing his masterwork, that is The Waste Land. So when he was writing this masterwork, he had to work as a bank clerk for his living. Perhaps the second greatest poet of the century, Philip Larkin, was a university librarian. Again, the second greatest poet of the century, Philip Larkin, he had to work as well when he was writing poetry, right? So he worked as university librarian when he was writing his poetry. Despite this bleak economic outlook, vast amounts of poetry have been produced in the 20th century. So, despite this you can say bleak economic outlook, or the bleak or the very depressing economic situation, a wide amount of poetry was produced in that 20th century as well. In that 20th century and in those times. So poets were not earning a lot, right? So they were not earning from their poetry. They had to work. They had for the living. So still, vast amounts of poetry was produced in that time. To map out the mass of 20th century poetry, we can identify two broad streams of the period. So let us look at the two broad streams of the period. First one is traditional associated with Thomas Hardy, and second one is modernist associated with T.S. Eliot. So these were two traditions of the 20th century poetry, right? First one you can call it traditional, and traditional was associated or linked with Thomas Hardy, and second one is modernist, that is associated with T.S. Eliot. As we saw in the earlier lecture on Hardy, his novel writing ended in the mid 1890s, you can say during the Victorian era. So his novel writing was over, but he as a writer, as a poet, was not over, right? So he still went beyond this, and he still continued writing in the modern era as well, in the 20th century as well, after which he devoted himself almost exclusively to poetry. You can say that when his novel writing ended in at the end of Victorian era in mid 1890s, so he devoted himself exclusively to poetry in this modern era, in this modern 20th century, you can say. The separate burial of his heart and his body after death tells us much about the reverence in which Hardy was held by the English. His body was cremated and interred in the port's corner of Westminster Abbey. So we discussed this point when we were discussing Hardy as a Victorian writer, right? We also discussed these things in that lecture as well. That his body was divided into different portions, right? His mind was buried in different place in Wessex, right? And then his body was cremated, and it was you can say burned into ashes, and then it was buried in the port's corner of Westminster Abbey. So it showed that how that it showed the amount of respect that Hardy received from the English, you can say, people from the country, right? Hardy's poetry can be summed up the familiar motto, keep it simple. So this technique can be traced back to the lyrical ballads of Coleridge and Wordsworth, recarrying, for example, the sublime simplicity of Wordsworth's Lucy poems. So his poetry can be summed up, you can say, with the more familiar motto, that is keep it simple. His techniques are related to or can be traced back to lyrical ballads, the work produced by Coleridge and Wordsworth, right? So his poetry is kind of his poetry followed this motto, keep it simple, right? He believed in the simplicity, the sublime simplicity of Wordsworth's Lucy poem. So he followed those things. So is this simplicity and the simplicity which can be followed in Wordsworth and Coleridge and in those works, so that simplicity can also be related to or can be founded in Hardy's work as well. However, the modernists opted for free verse, but Hardy retained the old disciplines of rhyme and meter, although he experimented with them. So, although modernists believed in free verse, right, they opted for free verse, but Hardy retained the old disciplines of rhyme and meter. He believed in the old system of rhyme and meter that was there, that can be found in Wordsworth and Coleridge and the other poets as well. He was, to some extent, an innovator, but within fairly rigid confines metrically and episodically. So you can say that he was in a way innovator of this style of rhyme or a different meter. Uh, you can say that he was a kind of innovator to some extent, but but in within fairly rigid confines, within fairly rigid limits, right? He was somewhat innovator to some extent of meter, right? But to some extent with certain limits, right? And episodically as well. Like Wordsworth, Hardy was also influenced by folk songs, ballads, and even in Hardy's case, music hall songs. So Hardy was also like Wordsworth, influenced by these things like folk songs, ballads, and hall songs, etc. Latched onto these influences were the self-educated man's reference for polysyllabic words. So he was also, as he was influenced by these songs, so folk songs, ballads, etc. So he also was self-educated educated man. Uh, so you can say that was he was such a man that who had reverence for polysyllabic words, right? The words which have many syllables. So he had a kind of reverence and respect for such words. He used to use these words in his poetry as well. We might guess that Hardy's favorite poets was Walter Scott and Homer. So they were his favorite poets. We might guess that, right? Disastrously, he even attempted a Homeric poem, the Dines, focused on the hero figure of Napoleon. So he also attempted the hero Homeric poem, right, epic, right, named as entitled as the Dines, and which focused on the hero figure of Napoleon. Prominent on Hardy's bookshelf was Darwin's Origin of Species. So, of course, it was Darwin's work, Origin of Species. So, this was prominent on Hardy's bookshelf, right? So, which he read as a tragic contradiction of religion. So, Hardy read it or took it as a tragic contradiction of religion. Hardy took this work, that is Origin of Species, as a tragic contradiction of religion. The point is that Hardy had big ideas, but he was at his best when he put them in tiny, beautiful containers. So Hardy, no doubt, had big ideas. He was master of authoring big ideas, right? But when he was at his best, when he was at his best when he put them in tiny, beautiful containers, because Hardy was master of language. So he was master of using beautiful language. So he was at his best when he put these big ideas in tiny, beautiful containers, right? In the earlier lecture on Hardy, we touched on the Impercipient, a poem in which he pictures himself poignantly as standing outside a church, entranced by the beauty of the structure. So, in this poem, we also discussed this poem. I'll touch upon this poem in the previous lectures on Hardy. That this poem, in the Impercipient, this is a poem where he pictures himself poignantly, you can say, sentimentally standing outside a church, and he is entranced by the beauty of the structure inside the church, beauty of the inner structure of the church, right? Uh, and he is poignantly feeling that and standing outside the church by the also the music within, and to some extent by the faith of those who believe. So Hardy himself felt excluded from belief. So he himself felt excluded from belief, but he was entranced by the beauty of the inner structure of the church. So this is the poem in which Hardy showed his love for the beauty of the inner structure of the church. Lyrical simplicity and a kind of stoical pessimism. These are the active ingredients in Hardy's words. So these are the active ingredients, are the part and parcel of the Hardy's words, right? What are those things? That the first one is lyrical simplicity, that is there in Hardy's work or words, and a kind of stoical pessimism. So these two things are the ingredients of Hardy's words. One of Hardy's most characteristic poems is The Convergence of the Twain. The title alone points to Hardy with the combination of polysyllabic word convergence and the dialect word twain. So this is another, you can say this is Hardy's most, the convergence of the twain is the most characteristic of Hardy's poem, and in which the word convergence shows the Hardy's love or his inclination for using the polysyllabic words, that is convergence. So it shows that Hardy had inclination for some polysyllabic words, and another word that is twain. uh, Twain. So it shows that Hardy was a master of using the polysyllabic words or the combination of the polysyllabic word like convergence with a dialect word, that is Twain, right? Dialect word, or kind of, you can say, uh, it's a variety of language that is characteristic of a particular area, community, or group, often different from other varieties of the same language in minor ways as regards vocabulary, style, spelling, and pronunciation, right? Or you can say this dialect is also perceived as substandard or wrong language, or sometimes it also is also a language, often a regional or minority language, right? As part of a group or family of languages, especially if they are viewed as a single language or if contrasted with a standardized variety. So Hardy was master of using using polysyllabic word like convergence, and also the dialect word like twain. On April 15, 1912, the Titanic, the pride of Britain's merchant marine, struck an iceberg and sank with significant loss of life. So on April 15, 1912, uh, the Titanic, which was thought as, or you can say, which was considered as unsinkable Titanic, it actually sank, and by striking an iceberg and iceberg, and it sank, and you can say with it, and significant loss of life also happened there. And this incident or this event, it was Hardy saw this event as both tragic and emblematic of human pride and its inevitable fall. So Hardy thought of this incident because Britain had pride in this ship, right? In this Titanic, Britain thought of Britain considered this Titanic as unsinkable Titanic, right? So still, it sank by striking an iceberg, and Hardy actually considered this event both tragic and emblematic of human pride as its inevitable fall. So Hardy thought that human pride had to fall, right? So he considered this human pride as inevitable. He considered that there is an inevitable fall for human pride. So Hardy also thought that this event is really tragic, and it demonstrated to Hardy the truth of his vision of life, the Darwinistic truth, a sense that the immanent will was hostile to man, and the idea that one should confront that fact bravely, which is what the poem does. So it showed you Hardy that uh, the truth of his vision of life as well. The Darwinistic truth. So he thought that this immanent or the natural or you can say intrinsic will they was hostile to man, and the idea that one should confront that fact bravely, which is what the poem does. So it this thing this sinking of Titanic in April 1912 show that this immanent or natural or intrinsic will is this is hostile to man. The poem lingers on the image of the fatal iceberg growing to its full size at the same time as the great liner is being built in the British shipyard. Pride and its fall are simultaneously conceived by fate, the imminent will. So this poem lingers on the image of the fatal iceberg, first of all. Then it grows to its full size at the same time as the great liner is being built in the British shipyard, and pride and its fall are simultaneously conceived by fate. uh, you can say that this poem, Imminent Will, the main point is that in this poem, pride and its fall are simultaneously conceived by fate. So you can say that pride has its inevitable fall. So this is the main point in the poem as well, which Hardy wants to demonstrate the shows. As the poem continues, the ship lies at the bottom of the seabed. So here at the start, poem lingers on the fatal iceberg. Then the ship lies at the bottom of the seabed, a luxurious graveyard and a symbol of what Johnson earlier called the vanity of human wishes. So this poem continues, and when this continues, the ship is there at the bottom of the seabed. Of course, the ship has sank already. So the ship has already sunk. So the poem continues show the ship at the bottom of the seabed, right? It like a luxurious graveyard and a symbol of what Johnson earlier called the vanity of human wishes. Of course, this is the vanity of human wishes. This is the pride of human wishes, which is there at the bottom of the sea now, because the Britain used to take pride in this Titanic. Note that Hardy uses the difficult words from triplets, three-line stanzas of variable length with the same rhyme words. So, of course, Hardy is master of language of using this triplet. This is not an easy form of writing, right? So, let me show you some stanzas from the poem as well. Here is a stanza from the poem. And as the smart ship grew in stature, grace, and hue, in shadowy silence distance grew the iceberg too. Alien they seemed to be, no mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history. In the solitude of the sea, deep from human vanity, and the pride of life that planned her, still couches she. Over the mirrors meant to gloss the opulent, the sea-worn crawls, grotesque, slimed, dumb, indifferent.